Should I say we're live?
Mm-hmm.
Jamani.
Hello.
Yes. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet. Thank you for joining, Mr. Khamisi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining again. We are just waiting for our guests.
There you go. Do you
Hello,
see me?
sir.
Kind of dark
You,
again.
you're in too much light. How are you? Okay, now you're perfect.
I'm perfect now.
Absolutely perfect.
Okie dokie.
How are you?
I am very well, and you?
Absolutely fantastic. I was, as usual, going through your books and thinking about how amazing your work is and feeling absolutely honored. I don't have your latest book, so I do have Dash Before Dusk. I've got The Wretched African, and I've got Looters and Grabbers. And I believe you have a new one out.
I've got a new one. Yeah, I have a new one.
Uh-huh.
So thank you very much. It's called the Bribery Syndrome.
All right. And I understand in it, you are discussing about the companies that offer bribes to African countries.
Exactly. Exactly. That's what I'm doing. So
that
it
should be very interesting.
It is very interesting. It's very revealing.
Oh, wow. Okay. But before we go there, I would like us to start on this.
Sure.
I thought it was an immensely important and beautiful and wonderful and tragic book because there is a lot that's talked about regarding the transatlantic slave trade. But you managed in this book to actually highlight how the East African slave trade, Southern and East Africa slave trade, which was over a space of, most of it occurred in the 19th century, had a more devastating effect. And I was wondering whether you could maybe start by just reading us a little excerpt, because we've got people here who buy books, and we're not going to loot and grab. So I'm hoping that those who are listening, the ones in Kenya, can order your books from Prestige Books and have them in their libraries and get to know everything that you have been telling me from your books.
Exactly. But before I do read the excerpts, I would like to read a testimony from one of the slave girls that were captured during that period. There were three of them, one an Arab and the other two Africans. The Africans my hands and carried me in the air as I kicked my legs and screamed for help. They took me to a place where I found a group of perhaps 20 other captured people, young and old. They were chained. They tied my hands and those of other children with a long rope before we started a long walk. They did not give us food or water to drink. We just walked until we came to some houses where there were many other Africans. Later, we were transported by Doo to Unguja, which is Zanzibar. Some of the people were sold off in Unguja, but most of us were packed in a ship or a Doo. I just cried most of the time because I didn't know where my parents were, and there was no way I could find out. So in this story, it happens that the Doo actually was intercepted by the British Navy, and the captives were set free. And they were sent back to Zanzibar and then to Rabai by the missionaries. Now, this book was written in 2016 and is actually, I thought it was important for me to write this book because I'm a third generation descendant of slavery of the 19th century. It was important for me to do that so that I can talk on behalf of the descendants as well as on behalf of those guys who had been captured during that period. So it's a very sentimental book, very personal to me indeed. Now, I would like also to mention to the viewers that towards the end of this book, I have listed a condensed list of 260 former slaves as well as descendants. And I also have a list of about 64 slavers and brokers who are actually responsible for the capture of these individuals. So that's very interesting to me, apart from the fact that I also have some families that are already, descendant families that are already in the settlement schemes that I'm talking about in Kenya, which is Rabai and Freetown. Now, let me just read something here for you. I don't know how much time you want me to read, but there were three main slaves.
I think you can read for a good 5 minutes or a little bit more, because I think this is a very important subject.
Okay. Since it's very difficult to read from just one point, I have selected paragraphs from different places and I've put them together. So there were three main slave harvesting areas during the 19th century slave trade. First, the southern district, encompassing all the regions between Kilwa Kisiwani in southern Tanzania coast and Lake Nyasa. The second was the Zambezi and Lake Nyasa, and the third route was the central district, comprising the territory between Zanzibar and Lake Tanganyika. By far the largest harvesting territory was the southern region, which was inhabited by the Wanyasa, Wamakua, Wangido, and the Wayao. The majority of slaves captured in these areas were routed through Kilwa, which was the main collection center for slaves coming from Central Africa. On arrival in Kilwa, most of the captives would be sick from eating poisonous roots and would be emaciated due to lack of food and medical care. They would also find no relief in the stockades there, or even in the overcrowded doors for the short sea journey to Zanzibar. They would be packed in the miserable native craft like herrings and a barrel, and treated worse than as if they were brutes. The journey from Kilwa to Zanzibar was so horrifying that words cannot describe that which is sometimes drawn out of the vessels. Bodies, half living, mingle with the dead. Then comes an awful separation. The dead are thrown overboard, while the living are taken to the customs house, where dealers had to pay tax for every living person. The most unsettling phenomenon about the 19th century slavery in East and Central Africa was the capture and enslavement of tens of thousands of children, some of them mere babies. More frequently than not, they were yanked and separated from their parents, never to see them again. They were subjected to the most humiliating acts of aggression. Some were exported directly from Kilwa and Mozambique to India and the Muslim world to meet the growing demand for deckhands, domestic workers, eunuchs, and concubines. Others were sent to Zanzibar, from where they were either sold or redeemed by missionaries. Many others were killed or died of disease on their way from the interior to the coast. Those who were not landed at Zanzibar were shipped to Madagascar, Comoro, Mascarene, India, and Omani, and the lucky ones were rescued by sea by British naval ships and taken to safe havens. The Arabs used the children for a variety of work. The young ones were retained in households as servants, while older ones were put to work in farms. Boys were also introduced to homosexuality, a practice considered perfectly normal in the Muslim world, even though it violated Islamic teachings, which viewed homosexuality as a vile form of fornication punishable by death. In Arab culture, homosexuality was tolerated and same-sex love was reflected in poetry and literature. African children were also subjected to castration to satisfy the high demand of eunuchs all over the Arab world. The practice of dismembering boys was more prevalent in the Sub-Saharan and Red Sea slavery, although castrations were also common at Zanzibar. The best well-known source of eunuchs in Africa was Ethiopia, and despite the efforts of the king of Amhara to forbid the practice, castration continued to be performed up to the 14th century in the town of Washlu, southwestern Ethiopia. In many cases, Ethiopian eunuchs were used as doorkeepers at mosques in Medina, and in Zanzibar at the beginning of the 19th century, an Ethiopian eunuch was made head of customs and later became a magistrate. So basically that's the first read.
Thank you very much, sir. One of the things that you do is, I think maybe let's start by talking about the numbers. You know, you mention in your book, for instance, that, you know, the numbers of the transatlantic slave trade, which was traumatic on its own, versus the numbers of the East African slave trade, which was only in one century, and it just really seemed like a large number. It's almost like people were decimated from these regions. Can you talk more about that? And how did you verify those numbers?
Well, you're absolutely right. You know, those numbers are all estimates, and they were actually collected from different sources and then averaged. Just to be fair, nobody actually knows exactly how many people were captured, because a lot of them were thrown overboard, were killed on the way, or even died as they moved from, 1,000 miles to the sea. So during the transatlantic trade, it is estimated that during that period of 4 centuries, between the 14th centuries and the 19th centuries, 14 million Africans were affected. Now, if you compare that and the estimate that we're getting for the 1 century only, the 19th century, which started around the 1832 when the Arabs from Omani actually moved from Muscat to Zanzibar, to about 1901 when officially the slavery was abolished in that region. We're talking about 12 million people. Now, to me, as I agree with you, that this is, it sounds like it's a big, difference there. But I can believe, because the Arabs were very brutal. We're talking about moving people from all the way from the Congo, Uganda, all the way to the central parts of Africa, Malawi, Zambia, then northern and southern Rhodesia, Mozambique, Tanzanians, Kenyans. I can believe that figure could be that high, but again, as I said, everything is estimated here. Nobody will ever know. Although somebody like David Livingston says that out of 10 people who were captured and put on caravans, about 5 of them arrived in Zanzibar. That looks like a very high number to me. I think more people died than actually arrived in Zanzibar or Kilwa.
But before the Arabs, before you had the sultans and the Arabs come through and stuff, the Portuguese had been plying slave trade in this part of Africa.
Oh yes. The Portuguese, I think, came in during the Vasco da Gama period. That is about 1495 or so. Thereabout. We also had the French, the British, and we also had a lot of African chiefs who also participated in this business. So, I mean, from the records that we can see, the African slavery among ourselves may have started around the 1820 thereabout. But before that, in the 17th and 18th century, we had this slavery over there. But this is only one of several slaveries that we're talking about. There was this the Sub-Saharan African slavery, which actually took people from the regions of Darfur and southern Sudan into the Arab world. We had the traditional slavery that was there in 3,500 BC in Mesopotamia. So slavery has always been there with us. But we are only talking about what affected the Africans mostly, and which was the transatlantic as well as the 19th century.
Okay. You mentioned just now David Livingston, and I wanted to bring you to that because one of the things that you highlight in your book was how he was a major proponent against a major abolitionist on slavery, and yet he was friends with people like Tippu, who was like one of the most notorious slavers in history. Can you talk a little bit about those contradictions? Because it wasn't also just him. There were quite a few other missionaries who had a relationship with Tippu.
Well, this is a problem because I think the picture that has been painted by the historians, who are mostly whites or mostly from the Western world, was that the missionaries were above slavery. They came to Africa to help us. Yes, we can agree that they did, because my ancestors, my great-grandparents who were taken slaves were actually rescued by missionaries. But at the same time, if you read my book, you'll find that the missionaries were also big racists. They mistreated Africans. They were very friendly to the slavers, as you say. He was a very good friend of all the big-time slavers in Zanzibar. So was the other, missionaries, as well as the so-called what do you call them, discoverers. You know, that contradiction is very surprising because every time he went to London, David Livingston will portray himself as being pro-African. But when he went back to Africa, what he did there was definitely anti-African. And that's something that the historians don't want to talk about it. I did mention a little bit of it here so that we can correct the impression that was left there by the writers that I read. But I think we need more than that. We need to expose these facts that these were also very pro. They supported slavery. They financed slavery, and they mistreated Africans. Whether those Africans were working with them in the missionary, or they were just ordinary slaves. So that contradiction is amazing.
Beyond the contradiction of our time is really going fast. Beyond the contradiction of the missionaries, there is a key thing that we have been talking about. It's come up in essays every now and again about how complicit our own leaders were. Sometimes it was family members, and you highlight that in your book, where an uncle or a stepfather would sell a stepson. You know, sometimes it was the chiefs. Sometimes it would be the neighbors. Can we talk about that a little bit more? Can you give us an enlightenment on that?
Well, I know that this is a subject of discussion among a lot of people. There are those who do not believe that Africans actually sold other Africans to slavery. But the truth of the matter is that they actually did. And it's all a matter of greed. They would raid, for example, they would raid a neighboring village. Or deliberately go to war with a village. And whoever wins, the other people, the losers, will actually be taken slaves and sold. Now, the difference here is that during that Africans, trading of slaves, it was not necessarily a commercial entity. They were not taking these people at the beginning, at least. They were not capturing these people to sell them out, or they only captured them so that they could work for them in their household. But as the Arabs came with the enticements like guns and the exchange of the barter arrangement that they had with the Arabs, it became, it went further, so that the Africans became brokers. The chiefs and the leaders, the local leaders, became brokers of the Arabs. And they would do everything they could to make sure that they presented to the Arabs the largest number of slaves that could be captured. And of course they benefited. And that's why I said it's all about greed. So they are not, we cannot say that the Africans were totally innocent on this one. But at the end of the day, it's the little man or little woman who is powerless, who ends up actually suffering as a result of this business between the Arabs and the African chiefs. So it's a very sad situation, but a lot of us still don't believe that happened. But actually, from my research, it actually did happen. And it happened over a long period of time. And we can also read it from other literature there's one book that was written by a person who was actually a victim himself. He ended up at Rabai, at Freetown. He wrote a book, which is very difficult to get now, but he wrote a book in which he actually alluded to those issues that we're talking about now.
I've always thought that sometimes this historical revisionism, where we paint ourselves as not having done any wrong usually has much to do with the fact that we are trying to hold on to a semblance of a past where we're all kings and queens, when that is actually not the case, and there was a class system and there was everything else going on. But you know, your great grandparents were also enslaved and they were rescued. A little bit more about that. I mean, you talk about it in Dash Before Dusk. Maybe you can tell those who are listening about it.
Yes. Well, actually, my parents, my great parents, on the father's side, they came from Malawi, were captured in Malawi. And from my mother's side, they were captured in Tanzania, in southern Tanganyika. They all found themselves in Zanzibar, and they were some of the lucky ones that were actually bought off by the missionaries. And they ended up at Rabai. So what they did at that time, the missionaries, was that they collected these people are coming from different cultures. You know, they're different. They are even speaking different languages altogether. I mean, people from Malawi, from Tanganyika, from Congo, from all these other places. Each one of them came with their own culture and their own rituals. So they were all, you know, taken to the missionary at Rabai by the missionaries who bought them, and handed over to at that time it was called CMS. This is the Anglican side of the Christianity. And these people actually put them together and took care of them over a long period of them. You have to remember that most of these were very small, most of them were very small girls and boys.
Yes.
You know, 10 years maybe, because the slavers didn't want very small, you know, babies. They didn't want babies because they cry and create a lot of problems. They delayed the caravan. So they preferred kids that were a little bit, you know, older. So they stayed there for several years. I don't know how many years, I couldn't remember. But then it got to a point where just before the abolition of slavery in 1901, they were all you know, congregated together. And then each one of them was actually asked to choose, the men were asked to choose their wives from the groups that were there, and which they did. So after that, they were given small plots of land where they actually grew up some subsistence crops and so on and so forth. So the land that we still hold at Rabai is missionary land. So we have missionary land, and then we have the other land. And that missionary land is now being dished out or being registered in the names of the people, the descendants who are there now. Before it was actually under the names of the mission itself. So my grandmother on the side of my mother had a very strong Tanzanian accent. While my grandmother on my father's side still had a very strong Malawian accent. Malawian accent. So it was a mutual arrangement that was made by the missionaries, so that at least they could disband the camp, and also give an opportunity to the couples to marry, and in a Christian way, and settle in Rabai. So if you go to Rabai today, you'll find all these people, descendants of all these different cultures who are there. They have now been incorporated into the local culture. But you find, like in my family, we mixed. We have a mixture when we're marrying, for example. We mixed a lot of issues, a lot of rituals, you know, so that we can accommodate all our cultures and all our, you know, our
Absolutely.
emotions and yeah.
There's a question here for you from the audience. Somebody wants to know, is there any documentaries that you could recommend on this East African slave trade? And also they have a follow-up question. Was writing this book particularly harrowing for you? How was it emotionally?
Well, yeah, emotionally it was, because, you know, that's why I said it's very personal to me, that I was able actually to expand what I wrote in my biography into this book. When I was growing up in Mombasa, my father was the chairman of what they call the Southern and Northern Nyasaland and Southern Northern Rhodesian Club. This was a club of old people, or descendants, or some of them even actual victims of the trade. And even when Banda was still in London, and he was passing through Kenya to go to Malawi, he stopped over. And we gave him a party. I remember very well that party, because I was very small and I was serving juice and so on and so forth. Our house was like a center for this movement of people between Nyasaland and the diaspora. So much so that my younger brother, is actually named, one of my younger brothers is called Banda. And then I've got another brother who is called Kanyama Chiume was a very close friend of Kamuzu Banda. He stayed with us. Chiume stayed with us, and in fact he left only on the day that there was a big raid in Blantyre. During which time Banda was arrested together with the rest of the others. We had to bundle up Chiume and put him in a plane so that he could leave the country before he was arrested. So we have a very close emotional attachment as a family to these people. Now, and my father actually was invited to go to Nyasaland during the independence celebrations. So now on the question of whether there's any documentary, I don't think there's any documentary that actually speaks to this subject as such. Some people have tried to do some. I've seen some clips of some sort. There's one PhD doctor that had a clip. I can't remember his name, but he ran it on social media at one time, and I talked to him. I can find it. Whoever wants it, I may be able to direct whoever is interested to that fellow as soon as I can find out who exactly he is. I remember who he is. He's in the US, I think, but I can do that. But we don't have any documentaries that actually talk about this subject. We don't have any books by Africans other than this book. This is the only book by an African which actually talks about the 19th century slavery. Nobody else has done it, so I thought it was very important for me to do it.
It is a very important book.
As a memory to my people.
It's equally very readable. It's not a heavy read. So, and one of the things that you highlight is, as I read this book, I think one of the most chilling things I read about was, and you read a little bit about it on this, the kidnapping of children, from a very young age. And you say, not justification, but you mentioned that part of the reason was that they were so young that they wouldn't be able to remember home, and they could be given another religion, and but also I think that the diving for pearls, for instance, and putting the young girls into harems, that was really chilling for me.
Yeah.
You know, are there, I think, is this where we find like the descendants, you know, do we have any descendants of this, of these people, of these women, where these young girls who then became young women who were in these harems, perhaps in the Arab world, and in yeah.
Well, you see, the settlements that we have in Kenya are all Christian based. When it comes to harems themselves, I would believe that the descendants will be in Zanzibar and Pemba, which are the two islands in Tanganyika. But I did not come across any person or any information that will tell me that there were some people that were actually descendants of the harems or the brothels that were being run by these people. What I know is that most of these girls who were recruited into this were taken to the Arab world, which means that the harems were actually in the Arab world. The ones that were out in East Africa were run by the Arabs who were there. So I don't know when they left. I don't know whether they were, they left with them or what happened to them, but I have no record at all of what happened to those people at all.
Okay.
And I'm sure some will find it very difficult to come out and say that they were actually descendants of harems, of prostitution.
And there's particularly the other interesting thing about the whole trade was how there was funding from Indian traders, and then there were Arab slavers, and then they were working in collaboration with African chiefs. There was this whole almost like a triangle slave trade of its own with these three groups of people. A little bit more about that, perhaps, for those who are listening.
You're absolutely right. I mean, if you take the example of Tipu Tipu, who was one of the biggest slavers in Zanzibar at the time, and his father, he also was a big slaver. You find that they borrowed a lot of money from the Indians. The Indians even supplied them with arms, with guns, and some weapons that they carried with them as they went around in these caravans. Although Indians today, or even then, did not want to admit that they were actually part of that triangle that you're talking about. But the truth of the matter is that, and this was an admission by a number of people that I read, that the Indians financed the slavery in East Africa, Eastern Africa, and so did the British. The British consul was one of the first ones to be opened there. So the two consulates that were there were the British and the Indian at the very beginning, and then the rest of them followed. And there was a lot of financing, a lot of assistance coming from these people because they did not want to destabilize the trade, which was also beneficial to them in some ways. And also it gave an opportunity for the so-called discoverers, the David Livingston type, to go on with their expeditions in that place. They were also, financed by the Arabs and the Indians. So it's a big thing. It's a big conspiracy against the African. There was no way that the African could have won in this war. you know, because they were in minority. They didn't have the necessary, first of all, they didn't have the necessary support from their leaders, and it was just a losing battle for them. When you are captured, and that's it. That's the end of you. And the number of those who were actually bought by the missionaries is very, very small compared to the number of people that were actually taken away. They only bought the ones that they felt were very healthy. You know, they didn't want to take a risk with the sick ones. So the missionaries were also very careful in the merchandise that they were acquiring at that time. Although there was also criticism against them to the effect that they were also, like, you know, engaging in slave trade, because if they're buying slaves, then they're also engaging in slaves. There was some criticism about that. But overall, the number was very small. At the highest numbers, I think in Freetown and Rabai, it was a couple of thousands, several thousands. It was not like the millions that we're talking about that were rescued and taken to that place. So those are just the lucky ones.
Okay. My next question then, you obviously, technically, the East African slave trade ended in the early 20th century, and but as you mentioned, as you've highlighted so many times in this conversation, there was a lot of, like, you know, involvement by our own people, by African chiefs. Do you think, and I'm coming here, do you think that much has changed, as there seems to be like a lot of complicit selling away of certain things that belong to Africans by our president and stuff in a post-democratic, post-colonial Africa? Or is there a post-colonial Africa at all? Your opinion. You used to be a politician, Mr. Khamisi, so I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, as far as I'm concerned, the so-called post-colonial Africa is hinged on the fact that we all got independent. And after independence, then we say that it's colonialism has ended. So then we start talking about post-colonial period. But in actual fact, we're still very much colonized. Because if we depend on assistance from the Western world, from our old masters, then definitely we are not independent as such. I get amused, and I was amused even recently when African countries started asking for the debts to be cancelled because of the COVID-19. I mean, they're using that excuse to escape paying for what they borrowed from these colonial masters. I believe that we made our mistakes, and I can talk more about Kenya than about any other country. We made our mistakes right from the word go. First, by allowing the continued dependency on foreigners for our, daily upkeep. We did not want to, for example, we did not want to establish our own industries to process raw materials. I mean, we got the raw materials, we got the coffee, we got the tea, we got the sisal, we got all these things, but then we have to send all these things abroad for processing because we cannot do it ourselves. And the reason we cannot do it ourselves is because we are being discouraged not to do it by these foreign forces, because they rely on us for the raw material. So if they know that we're going to process the thing ourselves, then it means that we will process our coffee at home and then sell it to them. They didn't want that. They wanted to take it so that they can process it there and sell it to us. So I have read on several places where it appears to me that there was a discouragement from the British colonial government, for example, for us to concentrate on subsistence crops, maize, beans, things that we can eat today and tomorrow, but not on, substantive, products like sisal or anything that you can think of that needs to be processed. So we were discouraged from actually engaging in those products because they wanted to shut us out from the market. They wanted us to continue just to grow maize and eat today and tomorrow, but not think about how we can create jobs for our people and so on and so forth. So the post-colonial Africa it could be a myth. It could be, we may think it's there, but it's actually, we're still very much colonized.
Okay, but Mr. Khamisi, how long then do we continue blaming it on our former colonial masters? When do we take it's in a lot of African countries more than 50 years? When do we take our destiny into our own hands? Is it not redeemable at all? Are we like beyond redemption, and do we just give up our and say, okay, we're gonna look east, we're gonna look west, and they'll do whatever it is they want to us? Or is there light at the end of the tunnel?
I think there is light. I think it's still redeemable if we can if the African voter can be a little more serious about the choice of leaders that he makes. At the moment, if you look at the broader picture of African leaders from independence, the Mobutu Sese Seko type, even the Kamuzus and the Jomos and all these other people, if you look at them, you see that they created a situation for us that makes us believe that if we don't vote for them, the world is going to come to an end. Even when we know very well that these people are corrupt, that these people are criminals, but we are made to believe that they are the salvation for us. So that's why we have this creation of dynasties, whereby a leader lives, rules for so many years, and then gives the position to a relative of his, who then rules for so many years, and it continues and continues, because they think that we are the only ones who can actually bring salvation to the people, which is totally wrong. The other thing is a question of money. Because so many of us are poor, it becomes very easy for us to be manipulated. So that when election time comes and you're given $20 or 200 shillings or whatever, you feel obligated to vote for that individual just because of the money that you've been given. We try to be very, very sincere to in a very bad way, in fact, that, because this guy gave me 200 shillings, I must vote for him or vote for her. If I don't, maybe I'll get a curse or something like that. So we allow ourselves to be manipulated by these people. And the more they manipulated us, the more we continue to be poor, and the more they continue to of course, to perpetuate this colonialism, the African colonialism, the neo-colonialism that we are seeing today. So I am very optimistic, though very cautious about it, that things could change, but I think we will need many generations for us to change. We need to get rid of the present generation and the next generation, and maybe the following generation, we may see some change. But that is just an if we also are willing to change and elect people that, as you know, are genuinely interested in our livelihood. So let's not write ourselves off as yet.
Well, I'm just a little worried that by the time the not this generation but the next generation comes, we won't have a continent for us to save.
Absolutely.
So there's
because
that.
now I mean, if you take the example of my country, I think we've got one of the largest debt portfolio of compared to many countries. I mean, I think our debt portfolio is something like 6 point something trillion shillings, which is so many billions of US dollars, and we continue to borrow.
And how many notes are even on trillion? Shona Tiger, maybe you can tell us you're from Zim. Because I don't think a lot of people even know how many notes there are on zeros. Mr. Khamisi, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for talking to us. Everyone, you need this on your library. You need it to, they don't teach you this. I know this, they don't teach in schools in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria, in South Africa. If you have kids, get this, but get it for yourself as well, The Wretched Africans. If you're in Kenya, you can get it from Prestige Books. They deliver all over the country. So thank you everyone for coming. Tomorrow we will kick off at 12 GMT with Bissy in conversation. Bissy will be in conversation with? Bissy in conversation with Francis. So tomorrow, and then later on in the evening, we are going to have Contexio from Brazil. So thank you very much, everyone, and we look forward to communicating with you. And thank you very much, Mr. Khamisi.
I appreciate for being here, and I thank you for letting me, read my book. Thank you very much.
Can you kindly give us a last word before you go? What do you, anything?
My last word could be this, and you said it. There's this perception in Africa that we don't read. I want to debunk that one. I think we do read. The problem is that we need to read the right stuff. I see a lot of people will be very willing and, very receptive to reading books by foreign writers. But I think we need to go back to Africa and read what African writers are doing and what they're saying. I think we'll be shocked, particularly for those ones who have not started reading African material. The Wretched Africans is a very well-researched book. It's about 400 plus pages. And it's the third of my 5 books. I hope you will read this one as well as the others. I'm currently reading, I like reading African books too. And I'm into, since I'm writing my first novel.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I am into reading some African writers, and Chimamanda is one of my best so far. So I read her quite a bit.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye to you.
You too.
You too, sir. Thank